Well, hello, Vaughn. Here we are at the end of another busy week. I guess you get your thoughts on the passing of former Premier John Horgan and the public response.
Well, Harold, yeah, it was a sad week here. And when a person who's put in a lot of public service passes on, it's common to talk about thank you for your service and to acknowledge their accomplishments and all that. But I was really struck by the emotion in the reaction to Horgan's passing. Part of that is an awareness that he was only 65 years old and this was his third bout with cancer. But the thing that really jumped out to me was that some of the nicest things that were said about John Horgan were by people who never voted for him. I'm thinking of opposition leader John Rustad said, "It's a pleasure to talk to John Horgan, even when you disagreed with him," that he really appreciated the authenticity of John Horgan. And there was a lot of that. In my email, I've lost count of how many people wrote me to say, "I'm not a New Democrat, but I really liked John Horgan." And I think that, went right across the political spectrum. It was remarkable the degree to which that guy connected to people as authentic and the genuine article. Former Premier Glenn Clark said you cannot fake that level of authenticity. And I think he was right. I think you can see why he's one of the most loved premiers in modern times in British Columbia. And the level of affection for him was amazing, as I said, even from people who didn't vote for him.
So now with David Eby, maybe in hindsight, we underestimated how big a shoes he had to fill, and it's going to be difficult for anyone to take over that role. I think that was discussed at the time, but a very different leadership style.
Yes, a very different leadership style. And I don't think, Harold, that David Eby was John Horgan's first choice as a successor. I think he was looking at other people. Their styles are so different, right? And a lot of the comments we've seen this week about what was good about Horgan, willingness to delegate, not hogging the spotlight, giving his ministers mandates and letting them fulfill them, backing his people up, being really good at taking blame, being aware of the challenges of the resource communities in the province, particularly the north, willingness to change his mind on stuff that he'd opposed in opposition. You put that whole list together and you get a critique of the way David Eby has governed, I think.
Well, this week, all 93 MLAs have now been sworn in, and they're all ready to go, raring to go, I'm sure. Premier Eby is going to unveil his cabinet on Monday. What are you expecting?
Well, first of all, in terms of ready to go, they had them all in the legislature chamber yesterday, all the newcomers, 55 of them, right? And they were kind of giving them the instruction book on how to behave in the chamber, there's a lot of procedures associated with the legislature. And, they'll tell you to go off and read the standing orders before you get on your feet and all that. So there is a fair amount of a learning curve there for a lot of them. And it'll be interesting to see how that works out on both sides of the house. But yes, the premier, David Eby's been talking about transition. Now, he was premier at the beginning on election day, and he's still premier, and he's going to be premier next week. So this is transition from the first David Eby government to the second David Eby government. And we'll be looking to see what kind of a government he's putting together. So first of all, he's got 12 vacancies in cabinet, right? The ministers that were there and who lost the election and retired, they're still ministers because we don't have the new ministers yet. So there's 12 of them. And those are mostly major portfolios. Health is, we assume there's going to be a shuffle there. Finance has to be filled. Education has to be filled. Forest has to be filled. Indigenous relations. There's a lot of vacancies to fill and ministers to move around. And there'll have to be some newcomers. The Premier said this week, I thought the most important thing he said this week was that the clear message from the voters, as he sees it, was to focus on the issues that people talk about around the kitchen table. And he says the big four, and this is where the government has to focus: affordability, housing, which also relates to affordability, access to healthcare, and public safety. I think he's right about that. We've seen opinion polls where, even though people didn't agree on who could solve the problems, where people agreed those are the problems. They're practical problems. Old days, you'd call them bread and butter issues, the basics. So I think the Premier's right. That's where he has to focus. But here's the challenge. The Premier, when he took over as Premier 2 years ago, said those were the priorities as well. He acknowledged 2 years ago that that's where he had to make progress and show results. Well, the election result suggests that he didn't show enough results to hang on to a big majority. He barely won the election. So it will be interesting, revealing to see who he puts in place on those jobs. And in the past, we get what are called mandate letters. The Premier gives the marching order to cabinet ministers, and the letters are released to the public. Not necessarily the first day, but we get those letters fairly soon. So we'll be going over those letters to see, okay, for example, who has been given the job of bringing in involuntary treatment for severe addicts and the mentally ill. Is there anything different about the closure of emergency wards around the province? And the Premier's acknowledges a huge problem still, even after hiring 45,000 healthcare workers, government's number. But that's what we'll be looking at to see how seriously different are the marching orders for the second EV government when the first EV government didn't deliver the kind of results that were promised.
And then I guess we have to wait for the budget next spring to see if the dollars follow the priorities as well.
Yeah, the big dollar issue that again, we're waiting to find out how they're going to solve it is the New Democrats promised, and we had a story in the paper about this week, New Democrats promised like up to $1,000 would go in checks to British Columbians to cover the grocery bills, to reduce the problem of cost of living and affordability. And that's a lot of money. That's, I think, $1.8 billion, $1.8 billion for that. We don't know how they're going to deliver that yet. There are conflicting opinions, which were reflected in our story on this, about, well, normally when the government spends money, it passes legislation, or it puts the money in the budget and it passes the budget. This isn't, they've already made it clear, Harold, that the legislature is going to sit this fall, but just to elect a speaker and appoint committees. They're not talking about legislation. So how are they going to do this? Well, they think they can do it by cabinet order. There's some suggestion they can just tap into the contingency funds, which are big and unallocated. But, you know, it might be a nice way to start the new era by putting a bill in front of the House. I think the opposition parties would support it. John Rustad and the Conservatives have already said he's not going to vote against something that would provide relief for hardworking British Columbians and for families and that sort of thing. So I don't know how they're going to deal with that. But you're right. The full budget, the schedule for the full budget is the third week of February. And I assume they're going to stick to that. But I think they want to get that $1,000 out the door before that. Geez, it might be nice to get it before Christmas, you know, if you're talking about helping people with their budgets. So we'll see. We do have a date for the cabinet, which is Monday. We don't have a date for the fall sitting of the legislature, and we've not been told how they're going to get those checks out to people.
Right, especially during a postal strike. That's another story.
Oh, I know. Oh, yeah. It's,
so EB certainly does have a majority, a bare majority of 47
Yep.
in a 93 seat House, and there's an expectation that one of the 47 will be Speaker. So are the New Democrats still talking to the two Green MLAs about swinging support their way?
Yeah, that's the other really interesting thing the premier said this week. So when the NDP majority was confirmed that they had a majority, 47, one seat majority, I think there was a feeling that the Greens had lost some of their leverage, right? In 2017, the Greens had leverage because they actually needed a power sharing agreement to be sure that the Greens would help them pass legislation. The Liberals actually had more seats than the NDP. So that's what happened in 2017. But EB said this week, no, we're still talking to the Greens. And if you think about it, they're going to appoint probably Raj Chouhan, who was the speaker in the last House, reappoint him as speaker. He's a fine fellow. Everybody likes him. He did a good job. The speaker doesn't vote except to break ties. And in general, in terms of managing the legislature, you don't want to be in a situation of constantly having ties. The government doesn't fall on every vote by any means. There's specific confidence matters, 1 or 2 votes a year. But in order to manage the legislature, you need to carry a lot of votes. You need to move legislation ahead, to pass motions, even to manage the procedures of the House. So you don't want to be in a situation of constantly being in ties. So from the government's point of view, if you could work out some kind of an understanding with the Greens that you'd let them know in advance what you're doing, and they in return would say, we'll be there to help you pass stuff, we'll vote with you, then it would give the government a bit of leeway. The New Democrats have already told their MLAs that they got to be there every day. They've got to be within 10 minutes of the legislature chamber for votes, because when they ring the bells, you got 10 minutes to get into the chamber and then they lock the doors. So they've told them there'll be no leaves. But I think having some kind of working understanding with the Greens where they could rely on them just to manage the place and move stuff along makes sense. The question is, what would the two Green MLAs ask for in return? I don't think you're going to have one of those formal contracts like we got in 2017, but I do think the Greens would say, well, okay, but, we've got some issues too, so there's some things we'd like as well. I don't know what they would ask for in return. I think the government's already made pretty clear they wouldn't agree to switch the province to proportional representation with or without a referendum. We've been down that road a few times. I don't think that's going to happen. The Greens support the carbon tax. The New Democrats have said they're going to phase out the carbon tax for consumers in BC if Ottawa will allow that to happen, if the federal government will create an exemption. I don't think the government will go back on that either. One of the opinion polls we had post-election indicated that even people who voted Greens want to get rid of the carbon tax. So I don't think we're going to go back to that. So we're thinking around what it might be. The premier has praised several times, cited an item that was in the Green platform, which was to reorganize the healthcare system to reduce the administrative burden and the cost at the top end and deliver services closer to local communities. And the premier said that idea has some merit. So it's possible that the Greens and the New Democrats will work together on something like that. But we're really guessing. I don't know how this is going to work, except that the premier told us this week they're still talking to the Greens and they think they're making progress.
Is there a review underway already of health authorities?
We're told, the rumor mill around here says there is. So when we're into the middle of an election, the public service goes into what is called caretaker mode. They don't do a whole lot of stuff that wasn't already set in motion. They respond to emergencies. But one of the things they do is they basically say to the public servants, read the platforms of the 3 parties, and particularly the 2 main parties, and start thinking about what you'd have to do in order to implement. So if it's legislation, get the briefing notes ready. If it's policy changes, get that ready so that when the new government is sworn in, we're kind of ready to go. So because the New Democrats themselves said we need reorganization in healthcare, we need to reduce the administrative costs in the health regions. There's 6 health authorities. Reduce the administrative costs without reducing services. The rumor mill says that that's already been set in motion, that the health ministry has asked the health regions to come up with a plan to save, we've heard a number, $1 billion overall in administrative costs while delivering the same level of service in the front line. So I think there is some of that in the works already. It makes sense. The work must have already been done on how to deliver this $1,000 to people, because again, the government, Premier said it, we want to hit the ground running. It's already taken a month, and some of the problems out there are still going on. You know, ERs are still closing. Kelowna, RCMP are dealing with an open air drug market in Kelowna. Like, I never thought I'd see that. You know, all the problem, vandalism, all the issues that were out there are still out there, and they haven't stopped, even though the government's been sort of sucking its thumb and contemplating its future for a month. So they got to get going on some of this stuff. I don't know how patient people are going to be.
Vaughn, you also wrote this week about Eby perhaps watering down his threat to ignore certain conservative MLAs. Yeah. What's behind that? Well,
the Premier originally said there were some conservatives that he just couldn't work with, and the government couldn't work with. And he said those were the people who'd said really obnoxious and offensive, racist and bigoted conspiracy things on social media before the election. And it led to a certain amount of speculation that initially the Premier didn't disavow, that he was talking about ostracizing people who were elected to the legislature, and that, you know, ministries and ministers might be told, don't meet with these people, even if they're coming to talk to you about constituents, or the government might refuse to take their questions in the legislature. So it sounded pretty strong stuff. The Premier called it a bright line test, sort of like a line in the sand. The people who crossed that past tense, we're not going to deal with them. Well, he got asked about that this week. And yes, he corrected or clarified his intention. He said that the government is not going to take action against people or ostracize MLAs on the basis of stuff that they said in the past. He said they are elected. They have the same rights in the legislature as any other MLA. He's right about that. They have to represent their constituents. He's right about that. So he said, the only time that the government will balk at working with MLAs is if they revive the kind of racist, hateful language in the House, if they start doing that again, if they make motions to bring that back, then the government will, Eby says, take action. But it's clear he's not going to take retribution for stuff that people said in the past, where some cases they've already apologized. In other cases, their voters, however they felt about it, reelected those people because they had other issues they thought were important. So I think it's a pretty good sign that Eby has kind of backed off a bit on this, and probably will make things a little less acrimonious going forward.
All right. Well, we'll see about that. That's a lot of fun. Thanks for your insights, Vaughn. And when we talk next week, we'll have a new cabinet and more than enough to talk about, I'm sure. Thank you.
Lots to talk about. A lot of new faces for sure. And some rookies in cabinet, which is always can be stimulating, and so forth. So the big ceremony is 1 o'clock, starts on Monday, and I think it will be streamed live on the internet so people can watch it and see. And there's a press conference afterward with the new ministers. The wiser ones will say, I haven't read my files yet, and I'm not going to say much, but we're always hoping that somebody will free associate with things that the staff will be lunging for them to shut up and don't say anything, right?
All right. Great stuff, Vaughn. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Harold.